we humans would come to think that there was actually something meeting the conception of a divine being.
Well, it would seem to me that that the reason it doesn't necessarily, what I'm saying isn't necessarily proof. What it seems to me is that individuals who have thought about this say, well, no, this is an explanation.
Right.
And so all they're doing is offering an explanation, not in fact saying it's not a proof.
Yes. Well, explanations from evolution, if they are to actually be established, and accepted on rational grounds, need a lot of support. You can tell a kind of just so story, which I think that is, and it may be true. I'm not saying it's not true, but to establish it would take a lot more work.
Another question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think in a simpler scenario, if you accept the relationship between cause and effect, when you see an effect, you have to postulate a cause.
Well, that means we have a belief in a god or gods, so there must be some cause for it.
No, we see the effect. A thunderstorm.
Oh, I see.
A tree
I see
grows,
that.
and we have to postulate a
Okay.
cause.
Right.
And if we don't know
Right.
much science, then the
Right.
easiest one to postulate is a god.
Well, then, so that's sort of like the first of these explanations in terms of the thunder and lightning and so forth. The question one would want to ask is why would you think that it was a god that was causing these things? So that,
As a matter of fact, that was Democritus' explanation, wasn't it?
yes, that
Then see thunder and lightning,
right,
and think that it must
Right.
be caused by a god.
right,
And
yes,
that's why Plato wanted to burn his books.
yes,
It seems to me from your quotations that we're talking about a society in which there was at least a fair amount of open skepticism about the existence of gods.
Well, people wrote things where there was explicit agnosticism in Protagoras, which gets quoted in. I think this quotation is in Plato, but at any rate, it's quoted later on. And these explanations of belief in the gods, in some cases, imply that there are no gods. So that's explicit or implicit atheism. Yes, so people did.
We suggest that the society as a whole is relatively tolerant of those ideas, suggesting that maybe the average person was somewhat skeptical. It's quite unlike any others. They're quite unlike societies in Europe later on.
Yeah, I would think it very unlikely that somebody in ancient Egypt would have been writing things like this. I think there was a difference in the Greek culture and say a culture like that of ancient Egypt or Babylonia, where things were controlled by priests. Okay. I'm going to, by the way, who's going to stop me at some point?
Nobody.
Okay, thank you, because just cut me off when this has gone on long enough. I don't have to get to the end, so we can go back and forth a bit, and we'll see how far we get. What I have next is the quotations from Plato, which illustrate the point the gentleman over here made about the introduction of dogmas about the gods and the proposal to enforce these legally. So the first quotation is from Plato's Republic. In the section where there is a discussion of the education of children in this imaginary city that they're thinking of, they're talking about, what would be a just political system, and they're talking about its various features, and particularly the educational system. And there is a critique here of the stories that are told to the children in Athens of the time about the gods, the kind that I mentioned that you find in Homer and Hesiod, and an argument that the gods have certain characteristics, and a proposal that the poets who make up these stories, and Plato supposes that they're inventions, or Socrates supposes that they're inventions, will conform to these principles. And so I'm just quoting a very short bit of a long discussion that gives you the principles that the poets are supposed to conform to. First, that a god isn't the cause of all things, but only of good ones. So the idea found in some of these poems that Zeus, is pulling out bad things and visiting them on human beings, that's not to be allowed to be said. And secondly, that the gods are not sorcerers who change themselves, and nor do they mislead us by falsehoods in words or deeds. Not sorcerers who change themselves, because gods are perfect, and any change is a change for the worse. And not misleading us by falsehoods, not because lying is in general wrong. Actually, there's a very interesting discussion about lying, but because the reasons why lying might be justified, and they're specified in this discussion, don't apply to the gods. So we human beings, on occasion, might be justified in telling lies, but the gods are not. So this would be incompatible with a purified conception of the gods. So this is a kind of critique from a rational perspective of the popular conception of the gods, which implies, clearly Socrates believes there are gods, he has assumptions about their nature, and he's proposing that what you tell the children about the gods in the stories that they're told have to conform to these principles. And in the Laws, a very long and boring work written towards the end of Plato's life, these three old gentlemen are having this very long-winded conversation about setting up a system of a set of laws. So this is much more specific than the discussion in the Republic. What's to be the penalty for this kind of homicide? What's to be the penalty for that kind of homicide? For an imaginary new colony. In this part of the discussion, they're talking about the requirement of belief. So religious beliefs are to be legally enforced, and there are penalties, for not believing these things. There are arguments for the dogmas that are going to be enforced, but the proposal, which is, I think, quite alien to the general Greek tradition in which Plato lived, is to enforce them legally. So there are three theses, I think I mentioned them before, that the gods exist, that they are concerned for us, and that they can't be bribed. They're absolutely above being corrupted into flouting justice. So this reflects or corresponds to a point made in the Republic, where one of Plato's brothers, Adeimantus, is talking about these wandering priests who are in essence selling indulgences. If you pay them some money, they'll say that some prayers, and that means the gods won't punish you for the wicked deeds that you've done in the past. So you can get yourself off the punishment by paying them some money. And this is something that Plato was evidently concerned to, his view about the gods, he was evidently concerned to combat. Yes?
Just going back a little bit, because I know where you draw the line between Socrates and Plato.
Yes.
Socrates wasn't killed for religious reasons. If you want to use a modern term, people would consider him a fascist. He didn't support democracy. It was more that than anything to do with religious reasons.
Yeah.
But if you say he was killed for religion reasons, this brings up a dichotomy, because Plato believed in capital punishment for atheists.
Yes.
So, in other words, Plato is thinking, all right, if we're killing Socrates for religious reasons, then it's quite legal.
He's going to give you 5 years in the can first.
Well, yes.
I don't remember the details, but it's pretty horrific.
Yeah.
I agree that Socrates was not convicted for religious reasons, but the charges were religious charges. It was a charge of impiety generically, and the three components of it was corrupting the young, not believing in the gods of the city, and substituting new divinities. And the claim was that the corruption consisted in teaching these new divinities. That was all trumped up, and I believe that it was a kind of camouflage for a politically motivated prosecution that couldn't say outright what the real reasons were. Yes?
I think we can add to that being a fascist by nature, they didn't have the name, but being a fascist by nature was certainly a popular thing in those days.
Yeah,
Plato was far
if
more
some
of
of
a
his
fascist
students
than anyone
became
else.
worse than fascists, they became real horrible murderers.
Well, Critias was the prime example, and it was he and Alcibiades in particular who betrayed Athens during the war, went over to the Spartan side, also was involved in profaning the mysteries in 415. And Critias, the leader of the more bloodthirsty faction of the 30, whose conduct, I think, both of whom were associates of Socrates, and their conduct, I think, was behind the prosecution of Socrates, who was blamed, rightly or wrongly is another question, for having, being responsible for the way they thought and therefore the way they acted.
The corruptors of the youth actually was a fair charge then.
I don't, we actually have the text of the indictment, and it says that, and I don't know what the legal regime was in specific terms. I doubt there was a statute that said, "Thou shalt not corrupt the youth." I think it was a pretty rough and ready legal system. Anybody could bring a charge against anybody. There was no public prosecutor. It was all by jury. We had a jury of 501. We had 1 day for the trial. Prosecution spoke first. Defense spoke next. Limited by the clock. Jurors had their tokens. They put them in the guilty box or the innocent box. They counted it up, and the majority decided. And if you didn't get at least 20% of the votes for on the side of the prosecution, you would have to pay a fine. So that was a way of discouraging frivolous prosecutions. And there was not a lot of fine legal argument. Basically, each juror would make up their own mind without a judge to summarize the law for them as to whether they thought this defendant was guilty of the charge that the prosecution had brought. So I very much doubt that there was, I'm certain in my bones, although I haven't actually looked at the legal system of ancient Athens, that there was no statute that said, "Thou shalt not corrupt the youth." Yes?
Actually, hang on. Since this is kind of dragging out, we're just going to go till around age 40 or so, and then, so keep your comments till the end, and then we'll take your questions and answers.
Okay, you want me to
Yeah,
kind
so
of...
just kind of keep going rather
All
than
right.
getting
Um,
distracted. We'll go on for like
Okay,
another
so
15.
why don't I just hit the highlights, and I got 15 minutes to kind of wrap up what I'm going to say. I'm going to jump then over the two quotations from Aristotle. We'll ignore him. I come then to a guy named Euhemerus, who is from the 3rd century BCE, that is the 200s, who is not a philosopher, but who was a kind of deconstructor of myths, of mythology. So this falls into the category of explanations of belief in the gods. And his explanation is that those who so far excelled the rest in strength and intelligence invented for themselves a kind of superhuman and divine authority, and in consequence were accounted by the population as gods. So somebody who fancied himself, usually was a him, as a really great individual, claimed to be a god and claimed this authority for himself and got people to believe it. And this was how Euhemerus would explain different gods. And there is, in fact, a way of explaining myths according to this principle called Euhemerist explanation, which supposes that the god is really a human being from some time ago, who claimed a kind of divine authority for himself, or was thought by people to be divine, and so got elevated to divine status. And one writer in whom you find this sort of explanation of stories about the gods quite frequently is the poet Robert Graves, who has a 2-volume work called The Greek Myths. And if you read that, you'll see him often explaining these stories in terms of some real, actual human being who is transformed into a god. Now, this quotation doesn't say this is how all the beliefs in the gods got going, so it's compatible with believing that there really are gods, but insofar as some of the gods, at least, are really human beings who gave themselves a divine authority, they obviously, on Euhemerus' explanation, are not really gods. Epicurus, who's in the next 2 quotations, and Lucretius, his follower, were atomists like Democritus, and they had the view that any concept that we have is actually a generalization from what we have previously perceived, a kind of general image. Like the concept of a tree would be put together from previously seen trees that we've stored in our memory, and we put these different memories together, and that generalized image is our concept of a tree. So the explanation of the concept of a god would have to be that we actually had perceived gods. How else could we get a concept of the god? And Epicurus supposed that we perceive them in our dreams, that we wouldn't be aware of these gods in our waking life for the reasons that I mentioned before. But when we dream of these powerful beings, large beings, whatever, those are gods, and we've got a concept of the gods that is a kind of generalized image from these previous experiences. And furthermore, he thought that our concepts were actually veridical. So this kind of concretization that you talk about of concepts was part of Epicurus' idea. And that the words, the general words that we used, were kind of labels for these concepts, and that whatever the word meant, there was really something corresponding to it. And how could you tell what the word meant? It was the first thing that came into your mind when you heard the word. And what's the first thing that comes into your mind when you hear the word God, theos in Greek? Well, according to Epicurus, it was the idea of being supremely happy, blessed, and immortal, indestructible. So he says in the second of these quotations, believe that God is an indestructible and blessed animal in accordance with the general conception of God commonly held. Well, everything is composed of atoms and void, so what are these gods like? Well, they're made of atoms too. In order to be indestructible, they've got to be in some far-off area where they're not going to be buffeted around and broken up by things colliding with them. And they're supremely happy, and the implication of that, in the next quotation on the top of the second column on page 2, they have no troubles. Because happiness for Epicurus was the absence of bodily pain and the freedom from mental disturbance. So the gods, being supremely happy, they don't have any worries. And if they were caring about human beings, they would really be worried. So, they don't care, right? So quite contrary to the second principle that Plato wanted to enforce, Epicurus argues that the gods are indifferent. So don't think that they're going to punish you after death. This story that Critias talked about is false. And in the poem of Lucretius, Epicurus is represented as a kind of cultural hero who rescued human beings from the superstitious beliefs, that the gods were going to punish them. At the end of the first paragraph of the quotation from Lucretius, superstition in its turn lies crushed beneath his feet, and we by his triumph are lifted with the skies. I don't know if any of you have read Kurt Vonnegut. How many of you read Kurt Vonnegut? Okay, some of you. He's a science fiction writer and a kind of humorous guy. And in some of his books, he talks about the Church of God, the totally indifferent. Well, this is the church in which Epicurus would worship if there was a point in worshiping gods who are totally indifferent. Okay, and then next quotation from Lucretius is again an explanation of the origin of belief. The second paragraph of which is the sort of explanation the gentleman over here gave to postulate something as the cause is, in this case, not of unusual celestial and atmospheric phenomena, but the orderly succession. This is a kind of standard sort of cosmological argument for the existence of a god, a designer, or creator, or whatever. If we see all this orderliness, and some being must have created it. Lucretius attributes this to being at a loss to account for the order in any other way, and of course Epicurus with his atomism would have given a different kind of explanation. I'm going to skip the next thing, which is the top of page 3, which is a hymn to Zeus by a Stoic philosopher. And I'll say a little bit about the quotations from Sextus Empiricus, which occupy the last 2 pages. Sextus Empiricus was a physician and a philosopher who lived about 200 of our era, so he's several hundred years later than anybody that I've talked about so far other than Lucretius. And he was a skeptic. So he called himself a skeptic. He belonged to a school that was called Pyrrhonian skepticism. And the general approach of Pyrrhonian skeptics is to consider opposing views on any question about how things really are, and to set them out in such a way that you have equally powerful considerations on either side, and you end up suspending judgment. So the Pyrrhonian skeptics proposed to live their entire lives without having any beliefs about the way things really are. Okay, so you can just try to imagine what it would be like to live this. They had a recipe for how you make practical decisions and so on. And in the negative part of his writings, which are quite extensive and survive, he deals with various beliefs, various concepts, and the general pattern is first to consider whether the concept of something, whether it's cause or in this case the gods or virtue or whatever, is clear, and putting forward the different alternatives against one another. So you would even suspend judgment of whether there was a clear conception, and then for good measure to go on to the question of the existence. So we have this long quotation about the conception of the gods. First of which says, well, there's all these various conceptions, so how can any one of them claim to be the truth, because you can always set one of them against the other, right? And then he deals with all the different explanations of how we come to have a conception of the gods and gives arguments against them. Why these explanations are not satisfactory. I don't have the time to go into the details, but if you're interested. So the kinds of things I quoted before, the explanations of Democritus, that of Prodicus, that of Critias, that of Lucretius, are all challenged here. So you're left in a state of suspending judgment as to how the conception of the gods originated, which of course is where Sextus wants to lead you. And then he turns to the question of the existence of the gods. So this is the passage on the second column of page 3. Not everything conceived of partakes of existence. So we got to investigate whether the gods that we conceive of, however we conceive of them, actually exist. And so we've got people who say they do exist, people who say they don't exist, and people who say, well, they no more exist than they don't exist. That's the third position, is essentially the Pyrrhonian one, at least to lead you to the point of seeing that there are equally powerful considerations for thinking that there are gods and thinking that there are no gods. So you suspend judgment about whether there are gods or not. You don't believe that there are gods, but you don't believe that there are no gods. That's an interesting state of mind that not too many people have. So this is stronger than agnosticism. You might call it adoxism. So you're not just saying, I don't know that there is a God, and I don't know that there is not a God. You're saying, I don't believe that there's a God, and I don't believe that there's not a God. I have no belief on the question one way or the other. Well, what he does, and I'm not going to talk about the specifics, is first to consider a number of arguments for the existence of the gods. He classifies them into 4 types, and in some cases finds difficulties with the arguments. And then I'm over on page 4 at the last full paragraph on the first column. Here's the arguments furnished on behalf of the existence of gods. Now we should show that the arguments for the non-existence of gods are not inferior to these in persuasiveness. So he sets up the arguments for the non-existence of gods after having put forward or described the arguments given for the existence of gods. And here are a couple of those in the following 2 passages. And then his summary passage, the very last quotation on page 4. Such are the opposing arguments of dogmatic philosophers to prove that gods do exist and to prove that such a thing does not exist. In consequence, the suspension of judgment of the skeptic is introduced, especially, let me add to these arguments, the inconsistencies that arise in everyday life about gods. For different people have different inconsistent suppositions about these matters, so that because of this conflict, neither are all of them trustworthy, because they disagree with one another, you can't believe them all, nor are some, because of their equal force. So you're led to suspend judgment. Well, I'll stop there. Thank you. And we can talk some more if you've got questions or comments. Yes?
The question about, in a way, why the Greeks didn't get into experimental science, or maybe they did to a certain extent, but I noticed like you had the atomists and you had skeptics who seem to have got at least the proto-science, they're looking for explanations in the natural world, or at least almost by allegory it seems like they're taking things out of nature. But is there evidence of people like looking in nature for explanations of why things were? I know that just planetary motions would seem to have got down pretty well, but basically just comments on
Right. So there was a certain amount of systematic observation, and I think probably the first examples of it were in the medical tradition, in the Hippocratic tradition, with recording of case histories, and some generalizations from the history with cases and what happened after you used a certain treatment. And indeed, the word empiricus in the name Sextus Empiricus refers to the empiricist school of medicine, which didn't postulate any kind of theory about what really was going on, but worked from observation and extended it to parallel cases. And in the period after Aristotle, you get the development of special sciences. And Aristotle himself was a biologist, and he actually, observed species and did dissections and that kind of thing. So there was also dissection in the medical tradition. But there wasn't experimentation. Experimentation is something that took an awful long time for human beings to think about doing in a systematic way. Really, the whole, although there's sort of independent thinking, the idea of designing experiments and carrying them out, kind of manipulating the conditions and doing something and then seeing what happens, I don't think occurred to anybody for 2,000 years. That's amazing, because we think, do an experiment, but that's a real huge jump to think about doing a kind of thing like that, apparently. Yes?
Kent, would it be safe to not assume that Hero must have done some experiments?
Who?
Hero of Alexandria?
And Archimedes, and so there were a few.
Okay, you're asking about things that I don't know as much as I should.
Hero invented a very primitive steam turbine.
Okay, so he was making things. There was certainly.
He must have had some experiments along the way.
So he must have tried things out to see if they worked. Right. Yeah, that sort of thing certainly must have gone on. Now, what's the experiment of Archimedes that you're thinking about?
With a spiral to get water and mirrors to burn ships, and lots of experiments.
Okay, so I'm wrong. I'll have to look that up. I stand corrected.
Regarding the dream explanation, what do you think about this thesis that when human consciousness appears and then, you are kind of like schizophrenic because, being an animal and not having a consciousness before, you hear these voices, this inner voice, and then you think that it comes from God. And then there's another explanation where actually that goes along the law line, where it's not the strong and intelligent guy, but the intelligent, I think it's Strabon who says that the intelligent guy goes up to the strong guy and says, okay, make me the high priest, I will make you the king by the will of God, because once your subjects expand to more than 300, then it's very difficult to impose your will through baseball bats. So you have to have a more persuasive kind of approach. So basically, it's not the strong and intelligent, but the intelligent, the high priest, walking up to the strong, to the Charlemagne, right, of the day, and then inventing this, God by Dei Gratia kind of approach.
Well, the Strabo explanation is plausible, but of course one wants a bit of evidence to see whether that's actually what happened. You can certainly see how, if you could convince the population that there was some god who had given this ruler the authority, that this would, who had even more power than the ruler, that this would kind of consolidate the ruler's power. And this would be an attractive idea for the ruler. Remind me of the first point you made.
Well, the first one was that usually, I think it was by a guy in the 70s who wrote his book about the bicameral mind.
Oh, Julian James, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of Bicameral
gods
Mind.
appear when 50,000 BC, when the first
that's a fascinating book. I read it. I think in the end, he tries to explain everything. With the breakdown of the bicameral mind, he supposed. I don't.
I think he quotes his idea is that in in the Aeneid is receiving these orders from the gods, right? On Odyssey, Odysseus has his own thoughts, like it's not his.
Right,
it's
so
not
it's
something
your
received from the
left
gods.
brain telling your right brain, or vice versa. You're hearing the voices coming from the other side of your brain, and you don't realize it's you as well. You think
Yeah.
it's someone
Yeah,
else.
but I think he proves it with the two, the Iliads and the Homers as well.
Yes.
In the Iliad,
Yes.
the Aeneid gets these commands from the gods, while in Odysseus hears his own thoughts.
Right.
It's not from the gods.
I have, it was a fascinating explanation. It's a fascinating book. I have no idea whether it's true. I don't know what the state of scientific discussion of this hypothesis is. That's a fascinating suggestion. Yes.
What is the oldest documentation we have of these people? Now, I don't think you have a script written by Socrates on a piece of paper sitting
Right.
in any museum, do we?
No, and we don't. I guess you mean actual physical thing going
That's
back
right.
from
I mean, well, we assume if he wrote something, he wrote it on something.
Right.
And I don't think we have a copy
No.
of anything that Socrates or Plato
Uh,
wrote.
Socrates didn't write
No,
anything.
Plato.
What we have of Plato is a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, right? And the oldest actual physically preserved things are things that were used to wrap around mummies in Egypt in the 1st century BCE is about the oldest, and also things that were buried in Pompeii and Herculaneum when a volcano erupted. And so there's a library in Herculaneum where there are, bits of papyrus, and I don't know exactly the date. It's around the turn of the era. And it's these half-burned things, where you've got 3 letters and then a blank. And then people spending their whole scholarly career trying to fill in the gaps. So that's about as the oldest physical remains of the writing. So those two, of course, would be copies of copies. And the task of the people who work on the manuscripts that have come down to us and create the critical texts that are published on a printing press is to take different manuscripts of the same work, say the Republic of Plato, and compare them and see where the differences are and try to figure out what was the original text that Plato wrote, because in the copying, of course, mistakes would be made. And that's a nice art. It keeps a lot of people busy.
It's like
Yes.
an evolutionary tree.
It is an evolutionary tree. It's exactly what it is. Yes, exactly what it is. Yes.
If Epicurus believed that the gods were indifferent, did he then conclude that they had no dealings with humans? Or
That's correct. They just are blissfully there in the spaces between the worlds, living a life of Epicurean bliss, feeling no pain and having no worries.
So did he have any kind of creation?
No.
How,
No, because everything is made of atoms, which are eternal. Each atom always has existed, always will exist. It's uncuttable, indestructible. You can't even shave a bit off it. And the gods are made of atoms like everything else.
and so they come into existence how? Why are they constituted differently than humans?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And to me, it's a weakness of the theory, because every compound, in principle, can be broken up on the atomist theory. That's what destruction is. It's always, taking the bits and sending them in different ways. So why can't anything be broken up, including the supposedly indestructible God? And how could you tell, even if there really is a being that you're perceiving in a dream, that this being is indestructible? I mean, this is a weakness of his theory, how we could actually even generate the conception of an indestructible being from something that comes to us in a dream, because it's not manifest directly from observation that some being can't be destroyed.
Well, actually, I think it is, because the observation was that you have the 4 elements on Earth, and the quintessentia, the 5th one, which is on a heaven, and the heaven didn't change. So when the supernova came later on, that was a big, kind of a big
Okay,
poop in
the theory you're describing is not the theory of Epicurus, it's the theory of Aristotle. And they were very different theories. Aristotle thought that we lived in a finite cosmos that was spherical, with an outermost sphere of the fixed stars and inner spheres with the planets and the sun and the moon. And the quintessence, the fifth element, was from the moon out with a natural circular motion. None of that is part of Epicurus' theory. The atomists thought that the cosmos, this system with the Earth, as they thought, at the center, wrongly, and the planets and the sun and the moon and the stars going around it, was one cosmos among all sorts of them. And the universe for them was unlimited in size, and there would be world systems like this beyond the one that we're in, being generated and destroyed. So everything, they didn't suppose that the cosmos that we lived in was going to exist forever. So their view of things actually is more consistent with the supernova idea. That wouldn't be a problem for the atomists. So, I mean, they had no evidence for this theory. They just a sort of a priori argument kind of thing.
Okay, that seems to be it. Let's thank Dr. David Hitchcock.
Thank you for your attention and interesting questions and comments.